One of the points I make in my piece is that it is not the case. Even if you prove that mankind needs morals and moral laws and ethics and so on, you've still got all the work of proving a particular religion is true in front of you. So it may well be the case that we need moral standards, moral guidelines, and it may not be the case that that's also a demonstration that God created the world and that Jesus was his son, or that Muhammad was a messenger of Allah, or anything like that. You've got all that work still in front of you. But for non-believers, simply proving or thinking you've proved or proved to your own satisfaction that God doesn't exist does not mean that you don't have all of the work from there in front of you as well. So the point I make is, yes, as Freddie says, we've had this the last 10 years or so of the new atheism. A lot of people are very satisfied that they've shown that they don't think God exists, they don't need him. But I say you've now got all the work of constructing morality in front of you still. And quite a lot of the people who I think are in that situation completely deny it. A lot of atheists and secularists simply don't want to face up to that. They say ethics, morality is obvious. It's self-evident. One of the things I say echoes something that Jonathan Sacks, who's not an atheist, said in the magazine last year, which is that it's self-evident that morality is not self-evident. Morality wavers hugely and changes hugely across time. And it may be the case, and it's something I believe to be the case, that even if you're not a Judeo-Christian person yourself, even if you're not a Christian believer, you live, whether you like it or not in the West, in the wake of the Judeo and Christian tradition. You are downstream from Christianity, but you're not apart from it.
Well, one area where this is particularly interesting, you bring up in your piece, is the sanctity of life, the idea that life is sacred. And I think we're still living very much off the Christian, Judeo-Christian capital we inherited there. And there's signs that may be running out. And I think Douglas's piece starts off with this appalling story of babies being thrown into hospital incinerators in order to create heat so that they could reduce their carbon emissions or something.
Yes.
So generally, Douglas, do you think that the decline of Christian values in Britain is a bad thing?
I think the decline of certain of those values is a bad thing, yes.
Like the sanctity of life?
Like the sanctity of life. I mean, there are other parts of the tradition I don't particularly mind that we may have gone weaker on in recent years than in past centuries. I'm quite pleased with that. I'm pleased that people don't view heresy in quite the way they used to in centuries past, for instance. But on issues like the sanctity of life, yes, I think that's very regrettable. And as I say, not to be assumed, an example I give in the piece is quite a popularly given example, but is the number of non-believers who in the early 20th century went into eugenics in a big way. There's no particular reason once, for instance, the horror of the 20th century recedes into history. There's no particular reason why some people may not go down that path or similar paths again. And just quickly, a bad sign of it, which is one of the reasons I cite this in the piece, a bad sign of it is, why is it so often the case that if you come across something like unborn babies' bodies being used to heat a hospital, the primary source of objection to that tends to be in the public sphere from religious voices? It should be the case that also comes from non-religious voices. I can't believe that many non-religious people actually think, oh, this hospital's lovely and toasty warm because of burnt babies, but they've got to say so.
I think what it often is that the public has an instinctive natural disgust, which is something they've probably inherited from their Christian tradition, but it's religious voices that can articulate that disgust most effectively.
Yes, absolutely. And disgust is a really important one because it's an inherited trait, one that you don't think through. And disgust and inherited traits like that are very, very important to the construction of morals.
Freddie, you can't deny that when it comes to things like the pro-life movement, assisted dying, etc., that it's basically the religious people, churches, against the government. Is this why churchgoers are losing the argument?
What, because it's just them against
what the government seems to be pushing forward with? I'm
not quite sure. I mean, I think there are atheist pro-life voices, but I do think it's true that it's seen as, it's very often portrayed as a religious right against the sort of forces of progress and the forces of science that are going to make us live longer or die more happily. I don't think the way that Christians can win this argument is by showing that it is a Christian truth, if that's what you're saying.
And if someone comes up to you and says, is Britain a Christian country, what would your response be?
I don't know. Is it?
Douglas, what about you? What would you say if someone asked you that in the street?
I would say it's a country which lives in Christianity's wake, and that many of the things that we still value and treasure come from that, and that one of the tragedies of modern British and indeed European mankind is that we like to think we got here by some inevitable form of gravity. And it's not the case. We seem not to want to admit to what our past is, how we got here. And we think that it's normal to get here. It's certainly not normal to get here. And history has shown that many civilizations, I would argue most, paid no particular care to the sanctity of life, for instance. And if you think it is normal, if you think that rights and things like that are your inherited, inalienable right, then I think you have to make sure you defend and make sure you uphold that system very, very strongly. Or otherwise, quite soon, it's possible that you'll realize how lacking in inevitability it is.